translated, not Jehovah. But, you know, the ASV 1901 had Jehovah all through it. We're used to Jehovah. So it's kind of like, you know, if you ever thought about trying to move a cemetery, you can't really move a cemetery. You just got to leave it be, you know. And so Jehovah has kind of been left in there, but that is probably not the correct pronunciation of that. But at the time that ASV and those came out, that's the best we could do with that, which is another point about translating that we'll get to in a moment, that language changes. Our knowledge of the original language changes, and all that can be incorporated into a translation. And so we need an original language document to translate anything. And then we need a target audience, a target language. Okay, so if I want to translate English into Spanish, then I'm going to have to think about the Spanish. Now, because as you know, like English, all English is not the same. For sure, if you've ever been to the Caribbean, like in Jamaica, they supposedly, I mean, they do speak English, but I guarantee it'll take you a day or two before you can acclimate to that flavor of English. We have a student from Guyana, and Guyana is the only South American country, he says, that English is the language. And that's pretty cool. Anyway. But I guarantee you, Guyanese English is not like South Carolina English. It'll take you a day or two, at least it does me, to acclimate to that accent. But you don't even have to go overseas. You just go up to Boston, where they pipe the cow. Okay, I guarantee you, you're going to hear some phrases up there that you're like, whoa, I've been in English all my life. What'd you say? Because language is different, and especially the English language, it kind of changes. You know, just from some of us with the gray head like me, you know, words that meant one thing way back in the day don't mean that anymore. And sometimes, and that's the way just language is. And so a language, now the target language is going to be different, even if it's all English translation, because, you know, the Elizabethan English that you have in the King James translation, that was very understandable. That was very current in 1611, and so that was a target language then. But like the American Standard, you just think of that, the American Standard 1901, okay? The what? The American Standard. And so that is geared more toward American English at the turn of the 20th century, 1901. So that's going to be a little bit different. It still has these and nows in it. And I'm not sure, none of us, I don't think, were speaking age anyway back in 1901. But, you know, I used to work down in Sarasota, Florida. In Sarasota, they have a big Amish community down there. And I worked with a guy at a lumber yard. Only old-time Florida people would know Scotty's Lumber and Home Building Supply. But, which, by the way, was started by members of the church way back in the day, which is pretty cool. That whole backstory, but we don't have time for that. But anyway, he used these and nows in everyday language. He was a Mennonite, an Amish guy, I forget which one, but he used these and nows everyday language. And he could cuss a guy out one side and down another using these and nows. And so I always thought that was kind of fascinating, all right? But the target audience is what else is needed, or target language in any translation. And so those two things are what's required. All right, now how do we get from text translation? I'm going to go through this really quickly. Well, just for sake of time, but there's some key points in translation history, which, you know, again, kind of parallels how we got the Bible history. All right, and so here, of course, is the cross and just a timeline, not the scale or anything like that. Time had a beginning, Genesis 1:1. Time will have an end on Judgment Day, and God called the special people Israel out. When we talk about the New Testament documents, by 100 AD, all the New Testament books or the autographs were completed by then, okay? Now, you know, we can, you know, maybe Revelation was AD 70, even if it was, you have, you know, John's epistles and all that, 80s, 90s. So we're just giving a general term. By the end of the first century, all the autographs were completed. Well, how many autographs do we have today? Not a single one. We can't go to any museum and find the autograph of Romans or Acts or anything, all right? Well, does that mean we have no idea what the Bible says? Of course not. No autographs, and that word extant is a fancy word you'll hear in this kind of a lesson. But that word means it's not known to exist. There's no autographs are known to exist. But we have better than one set of originals. Now, of course, the Roman Catholic Church say they have some of Peter's epistles in a vault under the Vatican, but I doubt it. What do you suppose would happen if we had an original document from the pen of Paul or Peter or James? What do you think would happen to that? Probably people would worship it, you know. Think about it in 2 Kings chapter 8 in verse around 7 or 8 talks about the children of Israel. When Hezekiah went in and destroyed the idolatry, he destroyed that brazen serpent that Moses made to lift up in the wilderness. But it says there they turned that into an idol. Okay, they turned that into an idol, and so Hezekiah got rid of it. All right, but we have better than a set of originals. We have over, and I just heard, I just was watching the YouTube on this, and they say now there's over 6,000 pieces of evidence to support the New Testament. Now, what's more powerful in a court of law if I say I did something and no one else saw me, or if 5,000 people said he did it? What do you think has more power, more weight? It's the 5,000 people that say he did it. And so the fact that we have no autographs extant is really, we have better than that. We have all kinds, and in this field of study, they call these witnesses. We have over 5,000 witnesses or pieces of evidence to support the New Testament. Now, those might be fragments of a papyri that have what we know as John 18 in it, or it might be a whole scrolls, books. Now, Dead Sea Scrolls is the term that we've often talked about, familiar with. Of course, that has to do with the Old Testament, even though it was not found until 1940. But it had Old Testament scrolls and manuscripts and commentaries and a bunch of other stuff in there as well. But it's the witness, the 5,000 witnesses are what's, you know, carries more weight on that. All right, and then from the first century, after the autographs, we have manuscripts being written. This is not the scale or anything, it's just showing the passing of time. And so the further away you get from the original, you know, the further error is going to creep in. Now, because again, we're talking about fallible human beings copying the perfect, inspired autographs. Okay? And but see, all these witnesses, like if this manuscript here reads the same as this one down here, this is found in a whole different location than this one was. All of that points back to there had to be an original somewhere for that to happen. And that's what we're talking about here. All right, now in 1400s, the printing press is invented, 1450 around that area. And so now instead of having hand copy writings, you're able to mass produce. Now, the first piece of paper ever produced on the printing press, I don't know if the word commercial is right or whatever, but went out to the public, was a Roman Catholic indulgence, which was a piece of paper that you could buy to absolve the temporal consequences of your sin. So if you want to go fornicate on Friday night, you just buy this piece of paper on Wednesday or Thursday that says it's okay, and then you go fornicate on Friday. Well, you know that that's not true. God doesn't do that. But all that was to raise money to build these big cathedrals in Europe and all that. And that's really what spurred on, Martin Luther attacking the 95 Theses. That's what started the Reformation movement, but that's a whole other lesson there. All right, but when the printing press come along, and that was a good thing. Now, in between this, whoops, I didn't put all that in there, but in between all that, they got fat fingers on this little thing. You know, up until 313, Christianity was illegal. All right, and in 313, an edict was given by Constantine that recognized it as legal, not a state religion yet. It later became that. But in the time that it was illegal, you know, you didn't have all these big rooms with all these nice air conditioning. Of course, they didn't have air conditioning back then, but you didn't have all these scribes, you know, handwriting by the dozens. You had some guy in a corner in the dark, so they wouldn't see him, and he's in there trying to copy a manuscript to get it passed on to other Christians. And sometimes those people who were copying the manuscripts weren't even Christians themselves, because a lot of Christians were from the lower, economic place and were illiterate. And so they would just have someone else write it. And so when someone else is copying it, it doesn't mean as much to them as it does the Christians and all that. So, you know, and just in the dark. And I don't know what year Dustin went to preaching school, but I went to preaching school before computers, you know. Well, we had computers, but they weren't a household item yet. Sure enough, we didn't have laptops coming to school every day. And I would handwrite my notes. And my wife, not Jackie, she got spared that, wherever she is. But my first wife passed away in 2010, and I remarried Jackie in 2012. And I'm still on cloud nine, but that's another story. But my wife at that time, she would type my notes. I would bring them home from preaching school, handwritten and all that. And I'd try to make it as easy as possible for her. And she would type them usually the same night. Of course, we had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so she didn't always get to it. But I can tell you, even though she did her best, I did my best to make it easy for her, there was still what I would call manuscript errors, where she mistakenly Their instead of There, or whatever. When I blew out my knee in the year 2000, I was going to therapy, and the therapist said, if you put a space between the E and the R, it means the rapist, okay? And if you've ever been to physical therapy after a knee surgery, you might wonder about that sometimes. But, so all kinds of mistakes can happen when fallible man is copying the inspired, the perfect autographs. And then you get copies of copies. And we'll look at some of this in a minute. But 1611, the King James was translated. And the 1611 King James was based on less than 10% of the manuscript evidence that's now available. In the late 1800s, discoveries were made of older manuscripts, okay? And so even though it wasn't until the 1800s that these were discovered, they actually were closer to the original. They were older, all right? And so there's, thousands of them. In 1901, the ASV came out, and it was the first major translation to incorporate the new manuscript evidence. Now, there was a precursor to the 1901 ASV put together by Westcott and Hort and those guys, and the Greek text was basically the same, but this was the first real popular major translation to incorporate the new manuscript evidence. In other words, the King James translators knew nothing about these manuscripts back here that were really closer to the original. All right, but the amazing thing is the King James and the ASV 1901, for example, are like 97% the same. There's a few words, a few verses that are not in here, that are in here, and that doesn't mean this is liberal, that's conservative. It's a matter of what's the evidence, okay? What's the evidence? We'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, but that's just kind of a bird's eye view of that. Now, well, let me get back over there, just a bird's eye view of that. By the way, I can print all these out and give them to you, whatever. There, okay? So now when we look at this, we want to talk about manuscript variants. Manuscript variants, okay? And that is when manuscripts read differently, all right? And there's no doubt, like this is undeniable. Manuscript variance is undeniable. You can go to a museum and look at these manuscripts, all right? And what that's saying, this one reads different from this one. That's undeniable. You have to deny gravity to say that that's not true. But again, and I don't have it with me, but in the Greek Testament, any of the critical Greek testaments, and when they say critical, that term comes back from the 1800s. And when we think of the word critical or criticism, it's usually a negative connotation in our thing. But back then, it meant analytical. Analytical Greek New Testaments, analytical. They will have what they call the introduction of those. They'll tell you every single manuscript that we have. And there's 5,000, whatever. Every piece of evidence we have, they will tell you where it's located, like in the British Museum. I'm sure there's probably a nice one in South Carolina somewhere. I know University of Michigan has one of the best ones around. I say best, oldest, all that kind of stuff. But these things are there. You can go. Sometimes you can make an appointment if you're a graduate student or whatever. You can see a facsimile of them. There's no denying that some of the manuscripts read differently. All right, and I just use this as an example. 1 Corinthians 6:20, the ASV 1901, for example, will say at the end of that, glorify God in your body. There's a period there. They don't have a footnote. Say some manuscripts add, and in your spirit, which are God's. The King James, if you look at 1 Corinthians and the New King James 6:20, it'll say at the end of that, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. All right? And so what we want to do is find out what would the original have actually said. When manuscripts differ, how do we determine which one is closer to the original autograph? Okay? And really, when you think about it, if you ever heard of the Restoration Movement, what did the Restoration Movement seek to do? It sought to restore Christianity not to Catholicism, but all the way back to the Bible. And so restoration is to go back to the Bible. And so this right here is really restoration. We want to know what Paul actually wrote here. Did he end it here or did he end it there? Okay, and so we need to look at the evidence to get us. And here's another thing. You'll hear me repeat this probably throughout the whole week. This study is not a liberal versus conservative thing. It's a truth thing. What's the truth? What is the truth? Now, I will say this also, for every manuscript variant, there are different sets of evidence. And so no variant is the same. All right. I use this one because this one's usually not that controversial at all. Some of the other variants can be a lot more controversial, but I just want to explain the principle here. Not a controversial thing, but just the principle. All right, so when manuscripts differ, we have to get to the original. And they call that study, again, textual criticism, okay? But again, this was coined probably in the 1800s. And what they meant by criticism there was more analysis, maybe, analytical analysis type of thing. All right? But textual criticism is not an enemy to the truth. It's actually an ally to the truth. Because again, do we want to know what Paul said? I mean, now this one here, there's not really a whole lot of salvation issues here, okay? Glorify God in your body. You glorify God, it's the important thing. And I don't really use that term much, salvation issue, this, salvation issue, that. Because really the Word of God, again, the autograph is perfect, okay? It's going to be true in factual stuff. It's going to be true in doctrinal stuff. It's going to be true in cultural stuff. At the time it's written, it's going to be true, okay? All right, but 7 standards of textual criticism goes into a translation. And the preferred reading, number 1, is old, okay? And this is the principle. Like say this brother right here, say he's the Apostle Paul. He writes the original book of Romans. All right, I copy his book of Romans. And then we go down this style. They copy it. Another 10 years later, he copies it. And we come all the way down to here. All right. The further away you get from the original, the more likely the error is going to be. Okay. And it's just like if you ever played that game in the classroom, you whisper in my ear, I whisper here, whisper here. By the time it gets all the way around, it might be different. Now, the way the kids are today, even when I was a kid, they would do it differently just to do it differently. But if you really tried your best, you'd still, and so, again, the further away you get from the original, the more likely the error is going to come in. And again, the autographs were perfect from God to the inspired writers. No doubt about that. But the transmission of it from the original all the way down the centuries, that's where the errors are going to come in. Not that they did it on purpose necessarily, but that's just the way we are. And even though we're trying our best, like the example with my wife typing my notes, even though she tried to do her best, I tried to do my best, they just happen, And but anyway, when you go to the older, of course, this one here would qualify there. It's older. The more difficult the reading, a lot of times it will lean toward. And by the way, these are not set in stone. There's a lot of judgment on that. When it says a preferred reading, that tells you there's some subjectivity there. What's objective? Objectively, the manuscripts differ. There's no denying that. Now, why they differ, that's where discussion can come in, okay? But the fact that they differ, there is no discussion on that. It's just right there. You can't deny it, rationally deny it. All right? Now, the more difficult, and the reason why that's there, now this standard here doesn't really apply to these. Both of those are easy to understand and all that. But scribes would tend to, if something was very difficult and understandable, they would tend to clear it up and say, copy it, kind of clear it up as you go type of thing. And again, part of that is you had people copying these manuscripts that weren't necessarily members of the church. And even members of the church did not always really understand the great value of what they were copying at the time. Why is there no historical record of baby Jesus outside the Bible? Well, he's just a baby. Babies are a million a dozen, and there's nothing special about a baby. And so there's going to be no special note of that. Now, if Herod has a baby or somebody else has a baby, there's going to be history about that because he's a big king. Well, if you came in contact with baby Jesus, you wouldn't think nothing of it. Maybe if you're a mom, you might stop by and say, "Oh, how cute," keep on walking. But, there's no, but he came, he was the Son of God. And of course, we know everything about his earthly young life only from the Bible, But again, this one here doesn't matter much with the present textual variant. All right, the shorter reading would be more preferable because, believe it or not, scribes would tend to add things rather than take away. And incidentally, when scribes added things, it was usually to make it more strict, not loosen it. And that's another misconception. We think that these liberals are trying to add stuff to the manuscript. No. They would add it to make it more strict. What's more strict? Glorify God in your body. Whoops, man. My fat fingers here. Glorify God in your body, or glorify God in your body and in your spirit. But here you're adding something, if you're adding, or you're taking it away. But, so that's that. But they would tend to add things. All right, which reading best explains the origin of others? And by the way, the shorter one would favor this one up here. This one here is, if this was original, would it be more likely that someone would take that away? Or if this was original, would it be more likely that somebody would add this? All right. And in this particular case, given the fact that later on, most of the scribes, and of course by this time you have really formal, you have big rooms, you have professional scribes. They each have a table, they each have elbow room. You have a master scribe who will read a line. They will write it out before the printing press. They would write it out. The next line, they would write it out. You could go down and check, as we, maybe if you've been in college, maybe, I don't know. If you've ever done that, if you want to see a copy is the same as the original, you go down and look at the last word, make sure they all line up, the last word in the original line, the last word in the line of the copy. And there's various ways you can do it without going word by word, so they would do that at that time. But early on, they weren't able to do that. But anyway, so here, given the fact that Roman Catholics believe in that thing they call original sin, of course, Calvinism and all that, it would be more likely that somebody would add this, and in your spirit, which are God's, because to the Calvinists, you cannot glorify. To the person who believes in original sin, Adamic sin, which is why the Catholic Church and anybody else baptizes babies, supposedly to get rid of that sin from Adam. If you believe that, there's no way you can glorify God in your body. And so they would most likely add, and in your spirit, which are God's. Okay? And so this variant, this one favors this variant over here as well. All right, the next one, which has the widest geographical support, and these text types are often given in terms of geography, Byzantine, Alexandrian. But if you can imagine, I don't have it here, we'll just pretend that this right here is the Mediterranean Sea, right? Okay. Alexandria would be down here, Palestine, Jerusalem would be up here, Tarsus would be here, you have Asia Minor and all that, Europe over here and all that. And so you have these different manuscripts coming from all over. So if you have one reading, for example, that's found mostly, over here, but then you have this reading that's kind of dispersed all throughout, and then you would kind of think that this area was more biased toward that, and bias is actually another one down here in just a moment, of style of the author and reflection of doctrinal bias. Kind of these things would kind of go together. But if you have a wider geographical support of one reading, and another reading is just concentrated in one area geographically, then you would think that the error happened geographically and they just copied from an error. Because if you copy this in one manuscript and a ton of people copy that manuscript, that doesn't really that doesn't carry more weight necessarily than if you have this reading found in various places throughout the Mediterranean basin. All right, and so that's kind of a textual variant thing. And again, this is no denying. It's objectively true. You can deny gravity, but it still doesn't do away with it. These scrolls are there, okay? And by the way, something else is interesting to note, that these New Testament scrolls, a lot of them were like no bigger than this Bible, you know, height-wise. They'd just be, man, stick here, about this wide here. And they would write columns and columns like that and roll it up. In fact, a lot of them were even smaller than that. They're about like 5 inches or so. But anyway, that's kind of textual criticism. All right, now, because the translation leaves out part of a verse or does not even, or even one or more verses, does not necessarily mean it's a liberal translation. Checking my clock. I told Jeremy, it's been a long time since I've been in a church building that didn't have a clock on the back wall there. So that's, you know, that's good. But at least y'all don't have a clock up here either. So, but I'm trying to keep track of the time here. All right, but you'll see these memes on Facebook sometimes that'll say, you know, the NIV is this, that, and the other thing because it leaves out Acts 8:37, for example. I think I might have that. Yeah, Acts 8:37. Well, you know, the ASV 1901 also leaves out Acts 8:37. And this is why a lesson like this is very good for us to know, because, you know, when I first went to preaching school in 1989, Florida School of Preaching, we were only allowed to use the King James or the ASV of 1901. But really, those are totally different translations. The common thing they have is the these and the thous. And maybe brethren thought that these and the thous makes it scripture. I don't know. You know, and the reason why these are left out goes back to a textual variant thing. And this was several years ago. Actually, let me. Yeah, that during the same period of time, I was in Friendship, Tennessee, which is near Dyersburg, Tennessee, my first full-time local work. And the Baptist church was right up the hill, and there was a funeral over there at the Baptist church who was a relative of one of our members. And so I went over there to the funeral, and of course the family asked me to stay with them to eat, you know, the little meal after the funeral. And I remember I'm sitting right here in a round table, and the family, we're all sitting here. And right behind me, there's another round table, so we're back to back, and the Baptist preacher was there, the pastor, whatever. And he was an older fellow, probably about 70, and he was talking to his table about how the King James is the only translation with God's authority and all this. And he was using the same arguments that my brethren had used. You know, more people were saved by this. It was translated by so many scholars. It was under the order of the king, all this kind of stuff. He's using the same arguments that my brethren are using sometimes, and that just hit me like a lightning bolt. Wait a minute. He thinks the King James is the only legitimate translation, and he's preaching Baptist doctrine out of it. And that hit me. It's like, wow. So it's not so much the translation as it is the preacher. And you know that as well as I do, that they could use the same Bibles as we use, but they're preaching false doctrine out of it. Now, they're surely, and I can sustain this, they're not taking the total teaching of the Bible in their hand. But that's the thing about translation. But I came across this document. It was on the clearance rack at a lectureship. And let me just, so he was, the Greek text here is what's, you know, we mentioned that there has to be an original language text. Well, there's two different Greek texts going on. The King James is often what's called the Textus Receptus, which is the Latin term, and it means the received text. Sometimes it's called the Authorized Version because it was authorized by King James. And let me tell you something. I did a study on Roger Smith, Smythe, I think. Anyway, he started the Baptist church in Europe. And it was talking about the reason why all those guys went to Amsterdam, they fled England and went to Amsterdam, is because King James, the same King James that authorized the King James Bible, was persecuting those Reformation guys who were speaking against the Catholic Church, the Church of England, which were pretty much the same except for King Henry VIII's wives and all that. But, you know, that's why those guys got kicked out. So King James wasn't some kind of saint, you know, that was all for the Bible and all that stuff, like some people portray him to be. He was a persecutor of the Reformation movement, which again wasn't like the Restoration movement, but anyway. But this Textus Receptus is what that Greek text was called. The ASV was based on what's called an eclectic text, which means they take all these manuscripts, they compare them, they do textual criticism on some of these verses, and they come to conclusions to make their text, okay? Now, again, there's not a whole lot of difference between these two texts, okay? But there are some differences like these right here, okay? Well, this document, this little booklet I saw said, you know, it was really criticizing this method, this Greek text, okay? But at the end of the book, the guy says something like, therefore, the King James and the ASV 1901 are the only legitimate translations. And I about fell on my feet. Because you can't spend a whole book criticizing this and come over here and say that these two are on equal par. No, they're not, okay? Now, again, the difference is not that much, but again, still a difference there. That tells me that that guy didn't know what he was talking about to make that statement. All right, and that's the basis of the newer translations. But anyway, so that's, and nowadays, we recently, at the School of Preaching, just to give you the evolution of computers, when I first started teaching there, we had 2 semesters of computer class. The first semester told you how to use a computer, word processing and all that. And the second semester was about Bible programs and stuff. Well, nowadays, everybody has a laptop, everybody's computer literate, so we just have the Bible program, and we use Logos Bible software. And in Logos, there's about 5 different Greek texts. And so this is the United Bible Society 5, but there's so many Greek texts now that's, put together by all these people here. All right, so the problem with some translations is not the Greek text behind them, but it's the doctrinally biased English translations. All right, real quick, there's 2 types of philosophies of translation. Formal equivalence basically is what it says. Okay, here's what the text says, here's what it is in English. The dynamic equivalence is what does it mean? Now, even this has to use this sometimes. We have what we call idioms, sayings. They had that back in the 1st century. And I guess that's the 5-minute bell ring. If I were to say, go fly a kite, what does that mean? It means, get out of my face. What does that mean? Get lost. What does that mean? See, those are idioms. They don't mean literally what they say. When I say go fly a kite, and that might be an old expression, but I guarantee you some of you guys are hearing about that. I'm saying, leave me alone, remove your presence from me, maybe would be the literal meaning of that. Well, the translation, for example, the first day of the week, literally is the first of the Sabbaths, okay? But no one translates that literally. They have to use a little bit of this. This is what it means, okay? And there are idioms in the 1st century that we find that we have to translate somehow or another. Like, for example, the King James, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, King James say, God forbid. How should we? That word God forbid, there's no word God in the Greek text for that. And the literal is, let it not be, or, no way, but God forbid is not literal. But in 1611, that did correctly convey, don't even think about it. It's not even possible. God forbid. Now, we use that sometimes. We'll say something like, I guess that's the 5-minute. Is that 5 minutes?
That's it.
That's it. Okay, so we'll pick up on this. Well, actually, I'll put this right here. Exact word for word is impossible in any language. I don't care if it's Spanish to English. That is 40 Spanish words, 40 English words. That's what I mean by word for word. You can't do that. Some Greek words take 4 or 5 English words to convey. We'll talk about that next time. All right, so that's it. Appreciate your attention. And like I say, the next lesson will overlap with this. And so we'll have that, and I'll say some more about translations then as well. Appreciate your attention. Does this go over there? No relax or ability. I knew I would get through it. Yes, it could be. Yeah, yeah, I would.